Oh, well, hello again. Okay, let's get back to our discussion on race and racism. So I just gave you sort of an exercise to think about how does institutional racism still happen today, right? What are some of the institutions and what are some of the consequences of that? So let's take a look at some of these. So, institution racism examples. Employment rates. Okay. Um, Employment rates have to do with job opportunities, right? In places where manual labor is oftentimes, and especially historically used, if those jobs go someplace else, if that factory goes down, disproportionately, folks that engage in manual labor are going to be impacted. In a lot of ways, that is done with immigrants or African Americans, Hispanic folk, uh, any one of that, the minority class, right? And I hate using that term, um, gets impacted, right? So employment rates are impacted. Income disparities look a lot of different ways, right? You might get hired onto a job, and this is also seen in gender as well. Get hired on for a job and get less pay because you don't have the same kind of education, or it might even be perceived that you don't need as much money, right? Maybe you live in a part of town that's poor, and the price, the living standard, right? The cost of living is lower in that part of town, and so people will get paid less because it is expected that they need to get less, right? They don't need as much. Home ownership, we talked about that. Things like HOAs, that generational transfer of wealth becomes really important to understand how that money is saved and accrued over time, um, and that can help dealing with income disparities and employment rates. If you've got wealth and sort of pride in that home. And that's an interesting thing, right? Even the concept of taking pride in your home ownership. If you just rent it, right, it's not yours, it doesn't belong to you, are you going to put as much effort into maintaining it, right? If it's not yours and someone's just making money off of you, do you care as much about your living condition? That plays into it. Residential patterns are legacy patterns, right? When you have communities that are predominantly, say, African American neighborhoods, well, there's probably a reason why that neighborhood was originally like that. And where industry and commerce develops in different places might depend greatly on those neighborhoods. So if those are poor neighborhoods, that doesn't draw in a lot of business. In fact, that scares business away, right? What if there's more crime? What if there's less educated people to hire, right? Maybe I don't want to put my store there. Becomes a cyclical effect, right? If you don't have a neighborhood that's got access to good businesses to find good jobs, to make good money, to buy that house, you see where this is going. Criminal sentencing patterns and incarceration rates. This goes all the way back to Jim Crow laws, which influenced and continued to influence practices in criminal justice, right? And we have examples in the legislature going back a number of decades, talking about super criminals, right? And who they are and how their relationship to drugs, right? And what is, because we used to have like a three strikes and you're out type program. And in some places, I think that's still in existence. That if you get caught on three drug-related charges, you could get a life sentence. Who's getting caught with the drugs, right? drugs are prevalent everywhere, right? But if a criminal justice system focuses on poor neighborhoods, African American neighborhoods, um, Hispanic or Latino neighborhoods, and those drugs are focused on more there, right, then those folks are the ones to see more prison time. Even though drugs are experienced by everyone, but there becomes this ideology around drugs and who's using them, right? What's the difference between crack and cocaine, right? How much it costs. Who has access to it? Who has access to a lawyer if they get caught, right? Even our criminal justice system, I think it's somewhere in the range of about 23 to 27% of cases that are brought before judges are plea deals, right? They're not even trial cases, they're plea deals. Lawyer comes up and says, hey, we got you for this. Now the judge is willing to say, hey, or the prosecution is willing to say, hey, we'll give you the minimum sentence if you just take it and avoid trial. Because if you go to trial and you lose, you could be getting 10 years instead of 2 years, which is what we're offering you. If you have access to a lawyer, that lawyer might say, hey, we can fight this. You know, we can do this, we can win. You don't have access to that lawyer because you live in a community that's been targeted for years and you don't have that generational wealth and you don't have access to those resources. You're more willing to take the lower sentence because of the fear of the bigger sentence. That right there is an example of institutional racism, especially when it's dealing with those communities that don't have access. It has that legacy. Death penalty, same thing. All of this can go back to, again, criminality, who's creating these criminal acts, why are they being created, who's getting caught more, who's being chased down more, who has resources to go after that and also to defend themselves. Infant mortality, right? Even today, if we look at infant mortality between the different racial groups in the United States, minorities and specifically African American communities have a higher rate of infant mortality and deaths with the mother during childbirth. A lot of this has to do with resources, again, having access to prenatal care. And even then, it goes even further into, again, that historical context of healthcare within the African American community. We don't have to go back that far into our history, living history, where people, specifically African Americans, were experimented upon in the early 20th century. We had folks in the South, in Kentucky, that were being, women were being forcefully, but also without their consent and in some cases without their knowledge, being sterilized because the government at the time, didn't want to see an increase in that population and thought that this was a perfectly legitimate way of controlling population. We also have the Tuskegee experiments. All of this created a system of trust or lack thereof, right? So these communities didn't trust going to the doctor. They didn't see black faces when they went to the doctor's office. They saw white faces. Even technology was focused on white skin, right? Looking for cancer, like skin cancer. Wasn't done as often on African Americans because of darker skin. Interesting side note, when the sensors that, and a lot of bathrooms today, especially public bathrooms, you just stick your hands underneath the faucet and the faucet magically turns on by technology, right? There's a little sensor underneath there. You put your hands underneath, water comes down and splash, splash, and you can wash your hands. Some of the early designs for that sink, right, for that faucet, was made without thinking about dark skin. So if you were white and you stuck your hands underneath there and all of a sudden the water would come out and it worked, and then you're African American, you stuck your hands underneath there and water wouldn't come out. And it's because that skin color never came into consideration when designing it. Now, that was probably not intentional, right? That was probably just an oversight by the designers. And the reason why it was probably an oversight is there's a good likelihood that most, if not all, of those designers could have been white. So the technologies that can be created, the practitioners that are available, right? And even down to the culture, right, of understanding those cultural differences, especially when it comes to healthcare, all of a sudden becomes really important as to how people are going to react, right? If we go back to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we saw this huge number of African American men that were greatly exceeding the sickness and death rates of everyone else. And a lot of people were asking the question, well, you know, what's causing this? What is it that's causing these African American men to have these issues? And there's a lot of reasons why, right? A lot of them come down to culture, right? You've got these men who grew up, you know, with stories from their parents and grandparents about racial injustice when it comes to medical access, right? Just going to a doctor, getting that same kind of care, right? The knowledge of experiments that were done on friends or family, or just knowing that it took place, not having that trust. If you don't have that trust, and if you don't believe you're going to get the same kind of health care, even today, that's one reason why those numbers were high, because there was a lack of trust, a lack of knowledge, and the belief that they would be treated equally. And so you see those numbers higher. It's not because of some genetic abnormality. And there could be a little bit of that too. Primarily it's culture. It's people not having that trust, having that legacy of access, or you know, that racist intent towards those people and those educated doctors not wanting to work with, or the fact that a lot of those communities didn't have those doctors. They didn't have the fancy doctors that could fix them because they were poor. Access to resources, right? So yeah, access to healthcare, life expectancy. A lot of that can even go towards having healthy food, having access to healthy food, right? You can have a food desert in the middle of a city, right? Do you have access to clean, healthy foods, fresh foods? Or do all you have is access to processed foods, right? Which is an interesting question. Even in Denver, right, we have areas and had, God, it was just a couple of months ago, we had this, there's something that Denver was voting on when they were thinking about opening up a new, like, residential center out off of Colorado Boulevard near I-70. And they're talking about some of the issues that they're facing out there. And one of them is that it's technically a food desert. You've got a lot of people that live in that area that don't have access to a nearby grocery store, right? They've got little stores, right? Little convenience stores where they might be able to go get some food, But those places don't usually have a lot of fresh food. It's usually highly processed. When I was working on the Ute Mountain Reservation, on the reservation itself, there were 2 places where you could get access to food, right? And this is for a population of about 1,000 people. You could go to the casino. The casino had a restaurant, and you could get food at the restaurant. Or you could go to the truck stop. And at the truck stop, they had a basket on the counter that had the only fresh fruits available, no veggies. Or you could go to the freezer section, and there you would find your assorted frozen treats, right? Frozen pizza, lots of frozen meals, right? Maybe 1 or 2 sections of frozen vegetables. And then the rest of it was all processed. So the only way that, let's say you didn't have a car, but you were hungry and you had to walk someplace, or let's say you're part of the elderly community and can't drive anymore, where are you going to get your food? Where's the closest place that you can go, right? So, and let's say you didn't have a car. One of the issues that members of this community would experience is they would sometimes have to walk to Cortez, which is about 11 miles away. Not a great walk, but one that's doable, and people used to do it all the time. Problem is there's no sidewalks, right? You're just walking on the side of a highway. And so they would walk to town to get resources, to get groceries, to get whatever they needed, and then they would walk back. And people were dying because they were being hit by cars. That is a situation in which that community doesn't have that access to resource, right? It doesn't have those things. And then you're saying, well, why don't you just build a grocery store? Well, that community doesn't have a lot of resources to do that kind of thing, right? To be able to maintain a store and build it. They've got a small population. How to make things safer. These are all things that different communities will experience, right? Depending on their race, depending on the legacy of their relationship with their neighbors. Education. Going back to Ute Mountain. So less than 50% of the kids that go to school at Ute Mountain, school-age kids, less than 50% actually graduate from high school, which is an abysmal number, right? Less than 50%. Of course, these kids have to go into Cortez to get their education, right? So they got to travel, about 11, 12 miles to get to the high school there, or to the elementary school or to the middle school, because there's no schools on the reservation itself. So they have to go into Cortez to get that education. That education comes with complications, right? There's racism in the school. And it's all throughout each of those schools. Each of those kids experience the legacy of that racism. And sometimes those kids don't know any better. Sometimes the teachers are a part of that same system. They've been institutionalized, have an ideology around teaching those kids. Those kids can be disruptive. They're not learning traditional culture. They're learning Western culture. It doesn't fit their culture, and so that can be, again, an issue, right? And then going to higher education, less than 2% of that population goes on to college, right? And it's something like 0.3% go on to gain a master's or any sort of graduate degree. So that's pretty despairing when you think about education. But we also have to consider what that education looks like. Whose education are we talking about? Right? We're talking about Western education. This is probably going to be a very similar system as it is in Denver, as it is in Fort Collins, or St. Louis, or New York. A lot of the same things are going to be taught, but it might not sit with that group, that history, right, of a different culture, of a different people. And so what happens when they read the history books and it talks about Native Americans? How are they portrayed in those stories? How are they seen in those stories, right, in that history book? Usually not well, and certainly within the last few years, better. But when you are perceived as savage, if that's how your culture has been portrayed, what does that do emotionally to that community, right? What does that self-image look like? Something you have to take into consideration, right? And even then, at the very end, accessibility to vote. Why do we vote on Tuesdays? Which is an interesting concept. Most people have to work on Tuesdays. If you wanted everyone to vote, everyone in the country to vote, you make it a national holiday. Or you put it on the weekend when people have time away from normal jobs. Why do it on a Tuesday? So some of these things have to be looked at, even though it seems rather innocent. Maybe in modern senses it feels innocent, that even though it's organized in a way that doesn't seem to have that impact, does it? Right? Something to consider. Okay, other institutional problems that we might be experiencing. I think one of the interesting things that has come up recently, especially in sort of higher education, is having access to like affirmative action, right? And I've known a number of people that are against affirmative action, right? Because they believe today it should be merit-based, right? We've had enough time for people to gain access to those resources. It's been, equal rights has been, legalized for 60 years. Why do we still have privileges going to these folks that need affirmative action, gain access to education, that kind of stuff? And I think the cold hard reality of that is that it's not equal yet, right? That affirmative action is still there in place because the inequities are still there. They're still being experienced by people. Even though ideologically we really do want to focus on sort of like this merit-based system, right? You succeed because you put enough effort into it. And again, ideologically, that seems like a pretty decent idea. Practically, we're not there yet, right? So thinking about those kinds of systems and how even though we want to move towards a more equality, equitable state, right? That's what we want. That's what we're working towards. To get there, it's kind of like if you think about a pendulum, right? It swings this way, it swings that way. Right now, we've swung over here trying to overcorrect for the swing that was over here, right? And eventually it'll swing back down, and hopefully it stops at that equal point. Hopefully, right? We'll see what happens. Racial ideology. I think racial ideology is something that's really important to understand. I have a friend of mine who is a Denver police officer. He's also African American. We were discussing one day that one of the issues that he has is that as a black police officer, and he sees these young black men or women that commit a crime, he expects that to happen more often than white people. And he expects these things that have become institutionalized. They've become part of an ideology of how people process what is considered to be normal. Right? That ideology becomes normalized thinking. So even though, if we actually look at the rates of incarceration, we see that there are more white people that become incarcerated. Per capita, it's not the same, right? There are differences. But how people are situated, right? What's the chance of getting a gun drawn on you as a police officer, right? And that might go into your brain, that might go into your training, right? What are the things that you look for? Does this person look like a criminal? Do they behave in a certain way? What is the level of respect that they show to that police officer, right? All of those things, all of those behaviors become a part of an ideology of how you should respond in a normal sense to any given circumstance. So these ideologies can be reinforced through institutions like the police department. They become institutionalized through the government. They get institutionalized through media, through schools, religious institutions. An interesting sort of side note to this is how criminals are portrayed within the media, right? In the past, it wasn't uncommon that if you saw a criminal on the nightly news, right? They're talking about someone that was arrested today because they were engaged in some sort of criminal activity. Maybe they were burglarizing something, or maybe they got into a fight, there was an assault, or whatever. Now, if they were African American, they might be shown with a mugshot, right? Maybe they'd be in that prison uniform, and they'd have the mugshot in the background, and you get that standard sort of look. But then let's say some white guy goes out and he murders his entire family, right? Kills his wife, kills his 2 kids, goes nutso, right? The media, however, will pull up a picture of him with his smiling wife and 2 children. Not a mugshot, right? This was something that was a terrible event that took place, right? Even though this guy did something completely heinous. How it gets portrayed, though, becomes very different. You don't see that mugshot, right? You see that family photo. Instead of the family photo for that African American man who might have did something, whatever that was, right? Gets that mugshot. Now, every time that you see that, right, subconsciously, you start making those connections. You start seeing the ideology of what's being reported and how it is being reported. And it becomes normalized, right? Language. How, if we look at different cultures and subcultures dealing with concepts of language, what is appropriate English, right? What happens if you are part of a community that doesn't speak that Midwestern dialect of English? What if your culture, your community doesn't speak like that, speaks differently, has different things, different focal language, but then has interaction with the police, with a judge, with somebody that doesn't speak that way, but has that sort of ideological idea of what language they should be speaking and how they should be speaking it? How does that influence? what is seen as right and wrong. So, this is something that has to be taken into consideration, right? Going back to slavery, it was totally, absolutely moral and ethical to own slaves. That was it. It was totally just fine if you owned slaves. There was nothing wrong with it. The ethics and the morals of the time said that that was the best way of doing things. Until it wasn't, right? Until we changed it and we fought a civil war over it. But at the time, that was seen as the natural state of the world, right? That was the right thing to do, that owning someone, right? And not having them have their own freedom to do whatever they wanted to do, that was normal. So how do we look at that, right? And even if we think about like Christianity, we were Christians back then. Did Christians say that it was totally okay to own another person? Yeah, totally. Because at the time, it was all agreed upon that yes, you should be able to, you can. In fact, you'd probably get rich doing it. You're seen as wealthy, and it's like, oh, I can buy slaves now to do the labor that I need. I'm actually doing good. Right? So how do we deal with those sort of ideologies? Right? And that's what you're going to find in any culture is an ideology. What is the best practice? What is the best way of doing this? What is the worst way of doing this? Right? So recognizing those ideologies, what is it that says that this is the most appropriate thing for you to do? And that's what it brings us to this next idea of manifest destiny. Okay, now during the expansion of the United States, we had this concept of manifest destiny. And to a certain extent, this still exists, right? This is still something that we have contemporary politicians that every once in a while bring up manifest destiny, like this idea should still exist. Essentially, this idea is that whatever happens is ordained by God, okay? And that because it's ordained by God, we have the right to do so. And so that we took this as the American populace took this and ran with it, right? So anytime that we had any sort of interaction with Native American groups, we knew that God was on our side, that whatever land that we were taking, stealing, buying was ordained by God and therefore totally justifiable, right? Engaging in the Indian boarding schools. A lot of time those Indian boarding schools were being run by priests. They were the teachers, priests and nuns. They believed in the fact that manifest destiny meant that they would convert these heathen people to be good Christians. And didn't matter the process, right? There wasn't a good or bad way of doing it, just as long as it sort of got done, right? That was that effort. And it became this ideology that as long as we kept moving forward in that direction, it didn't matter how it happened, just that it happened. It didn't matter who got in the way, let God sort it out. And this became huge, right? This is this ideology that no matter what, I have my religion at my back that's going to help me do it. And this is still alive today. So this is an interesting topic to consider, specifically sort of this idealism and reality. What happens with most cultures is that we oftentimes paint a picture of who we are, right? Even as individuals, we sort of have this idea of who we are, what we experience, and that sort of forms us. The interesting thing about that is that there is the reality that we have in our heads and the reality that everyone else experiences. And those are usually not the same thing, right? Um, again, sort of going back to that meritocracy thing, we think that everyone should start off at the same spot, have the same access to those resources, and if they work hard enough, then they will succeed and excel, right? And anyone can do it. That's our idealism, right? That's where we want to be. The reality is that we're not there yet. Oftentimes this gets tossed into sort of like that concept of the American dream. Anyone can do it. If you just work hard enough, you can gain all of the things that all Americans have access to. And only the ones that are lazy or, don't want to work as hard or aren't good people, right? They're going to be the ones that fail. And we know that that's not the case because that starting line is different for other people, right? It all depends on where you're born and who you were born to and the sort of resources that you have available. So you had to have all of these things, right, to be able to succeed. And the issue is that unless you were a white male, you were starting from behind that starting line, right? Whether it was 5 paces, 20 paces, 100 paces, you were still starting with that disadvantage. So, but we still like to have that ideology that, this is a free and fair society. Doesn't quite work out that way. Now, that's the thing that we have to consider when we're looking at other cultures as well. We're going to look and see how they see themselves. And then what do they do to either back that up, or what do they do to contradict those kinds of behaviors? So this is an interesting subject that I think is really important to go over. This concept of like white privilege. So I really hate the term white privilege. I don't think it's an appropriate term to use. I think the appropriate term to use is white normalcy. Okay, and the idea is that privilege is something that goes above and beyond what the normal person has, right? That's usually the term that privilege has, right? That this is something that is special. And when we deal with things like white privilege, for example, I've had a number of students in my classes over the years in which they were typically white men, and we'd get to this point talking about white privilege, and they're like, I do not have any privilege. I grew up poor. I grew up with Black and Hispanic friends, and I grew up in this culture where, I didn't have that privilege, right? So why should I be included in this, right? As an individual, I do not take responsibility because I didn't grow up this way. And my response is usually this. It has nothing to do with you as an individual, as a person, how you grew up. It has to do with this overall concept, right? As a white male, I can walk into any store in the country. I can walk into any store, browse, look at stuff, maybe examine it. Maybe it's behind a glass case, and I want to say, hey, I want to look at that. That's really expensive. I'd like to look at it. And people will be like, oh, yeah, here, take a look, right? Hand it to me and I can look at it. Oh, yeah, cool, right on. And then put it back down and then walk away. Not everybody gets to experience that, right? You might be African American and you might walk into a store and have an employee of that store follow you. Maybe you might walk up and say, "Hey, I'd like to see that piece of jewelry," and they'd be like, "Show me that you have the money first," or maybe no, I can't show it to you, or maybe come up with some sort of an excuse why they might not. Maybe they come up with some reason to treat you a little bit different, a little bit less. Right now, I'm not experiencing privilege. I'm walk into a store, I expect to be able to look at stuff and buy stuff if I want to. I've never had to worry about being followed by a store employee. If I'm walking down the street, I've never had anyone cross the street because I was white. I'm just walking down the street, right? Never had to worry about it. I've never had to worry about being pulled over as a white guy and have to worry about violence, worry about whether or not something bad is going to happen to me. I'm just getting pulled over because I was speeding or I had a broken taillight. I never had to experience any of those things because my normal everyday life is just like every other white person that's out there. So that concept of privilege, right? I do have a privilege over someone else, but I share it with all the other normal folks, those normal white folks out there. So we start seeing that these things that we get to experience and we experience differently, right? Even my example earlier of the black family going to that restaurant, right? If I go to a restaurant and I sit down as myself, I know that people are going to come up and serve me quickly, right? Not because I'm more special than anyone else, just because that's the normal thing to do. I never have to worry about the service that I'm going to receive. I never have to worry about going into a bank and being able to walk up to the teller and tell them my name and be able to have my name pronounced correctly. I don't have to worry about that being an issue if I wanted to take out a car loan or a house loan, right? But if I'm from a different culture, if I'm African American and I have an ethnic sounding name that bank teller or that bank representative has a hard time pronouncing, we have evidence that that has influenced banking practices. That people with the same qualifications for that job that you're applying for, John over here has a better chance of getting that job because they can pronounce John better than that ethnic sounding name. Doesn't seem like a privilege, it seems like normalcy, right? What has become normalized behavior compared to something that is special. So when we think about white privilege, when we think about those kinds of things, I think it's important to recognize that we're not talking about privilege, we're talking about normal behavior that people should be able to experience given any circumstance. Anybody should be able to walk into a store without having to worry about whether or not they're going to be followed by a store employee or be treated differently because of their name, because of their skin color, right? Because of any of those things. What are some ways that white privilege is still expressed? I'm going to give you guys a chance to think about this, and then we'll continue this in our next segment.